Hello, everyone. We are here today to talk about dementia and ApoE. I am William Strohman. It's my lovely wife, Lisa Strohman. Should I wait about a minute or no?
Yeah,
Okay.
obviously people are going to be jumping on.
Yeah.
And just as a reminder, if you want to put some comments in, I know that we're going to jump in and answer some of those. I'm excited because I got the final draft of what he's talking about this evening, or last evening, 10:30.
This morning, actually.
Yeah, actually, because it was after I went to bed. So I'm excited to learn along with you, and as always, ask questions that probably derail you and make you uncomfortable. So. And maybe start off by saying why you started researching this on the topic, if you wanted to.
Well, there's many reasons. But interestingly, I started testing this probably 3 or 4 years ago, and the more I learned about it, the more applicable it was to lots of different people. So I've done it on many patients, and then Lisa, I think you did something with 23andMe with your friend,
Mm-hmm.
and she actually has one gene for ApoE, and interestingly, 23andMe claims that it tests for that ApoE gene, but then doesn't tell you if there's one copy or two copies, which we'll get into.
A little frustrating.
So I did it myself, and I am actually a carrier too, so we're both sort of in the same boat. So we might have to get our kids tested at some point.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to talk about. So maybe start out with what ApoE is now that we've got people jumping in and listening. And
so generally, I'm going to give general outline. I'm going to go into just some general data about dementia, specifics on pathophysiology of dementia, how it's diagnosed, and then we go into prevention strategies, which ApoE is going to be one of them. And if time permits, there's some new treatment options available for Alzheimer's. I'll try to get into that, but we may run out of time.
Well, maybe on our next one you could use the iPad where you could draw.
Yeah,
kind of
that'd be cool.
Gene.
That'd be cool.
Not this time, sorry. Didn't think I had
I don't know how to share the screen, actually.
Oh, we'll figure that out.
So anyway,
Okay.
so dementia. It denotes a change in your memory, a change from your previous state, and it interferes with day-to-day functioning. So you typically have preservation of long-term memory, but your short-term memory becomes difficult. And the issue really is normal aging can have some component of that, right? So you can have normal aging with some cognitive decline, which is expected. And then sometimes, stress can do it, bad night's sleep, some alcohol, drugs, those can be, but those again would be more transient and not sort of consistent. So the most important thing is for dementia is its frequency and its intensity of issues. So who do you think's at risk for dementia? That's a question.
Probably me. I don't know. Oh, that's what we're answering.
Yeah.
Today. Okay.
Yeah. Basically anyone has
Whether
a brain.
you have this gene or not.
Whether you have the gene,
Okay.
you are at risk for dementia. So anyone with a brain has the risk for dementia.
This sounds like it's gonna be a good topic. It's all bad news.
It's kind of negative.
No, Well, I'm here. We'll flip it around.
So we will all experience cognitive decline. So that's expected. So hopefully it's just mild in nature. It's sort of like prostate cancer for men. We all probably are going to be diagnosed with it at some point, but will we die from it or die from something else? So it's an expectation that we're all going to have some cognitive decline.
So maybe an example that isn't just men, whatever.
I try to think of
a car. I know, but if you get into a car and you put your seatbelt on, we know statistically that you're safer if there's an accident. So there's preventable measures that we can take for ourselves to help ourselves, and that's what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Regardless of whether you have a prostate or not.
Right. So if you're a guy, the prostate should work. If you're a female, you can use that as an example.
Okay.
And then there's this guy I listened to, Peter Attia, is an MD. He sort of framed just general life into 3 categories that we're going to decline: physical, mental, and emotional. So you have the emotional component. Physically, we're all going to decline. So I can't play hockey as well as I did when I was 20. We all have physical decline. Hopefully, again, it's a mild. Mentally, cognitively, we will all decline a little bit. So I have name recollection issues sometimes.
Pronunciation issues.
And pronunciation issues too. So both of those are going to decline slowly with age. The one thing that Peter Attia had mentioned is emotionally.
Yeah.
That can be consistent. That doesn't have to decline, and I'm not really great at that.
If Peter Attia, he's an MD, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would say that from an emotional standpoint, I know he's one of your podcast heroes that you listen to a lot. Do podcasts impact memory?
Beneficially, yes.
Oh, of course they do, because that's what you spend time doing. But from an emotional standpoint, I will say that across the lifespan, I wouldn't say that there's no decline in emotions, because there's this perspective taking. And so sometimes as you get older and later in life, you can look back with an emotional perspective that says I didn't do enough, or my life wasn't as it. So
Yeah.
again, how you experience it, you're just saying from a genetic.
I'm just
physical
saying,
standpoint.
physically you're going to decline. We can predict that. Cognitively you're going to decline at a slower rate. But emotionality, you have a little more control over that, and that doesn't necessarily denigrate with age.
Got it. But it still takes work to.
Yeah. So he mentioned emotionality, and a bad thing to do is always compare yourself to the average Joe, or compare, like me, I'm comparing myself to the 35-year-old guy that's playing hockey. He's going to be faster and quicker and mentally more have acuity than I do.
You mean like Instagram and looking through people's scrolls and comparing ourselves to.
Yeah, so that's the
rest of
emotionality
global
component.
world.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's so. Anyway, you want to keep those in mind in specifically talking about dementia.
And you do emotionally get impacted if you're forgetting the keys, or you feel like you're not progressing as well as you were, or you start to think that my memory isn't as quick as it was. So that does actually cause an emotional response as well.
It will, depending on if you're going to compare yourself to when you're 40 or compare yourself when you're 30. Yeah, you're going to be worse, but maybe you shouldn't be comparing yourself to your previous age.
Right.
Like that's like it's like you can't really attain that. You're never going to be as good as where you were.
Right.
Although emotionality, you can get more in tune with things and stuff.
Right.
I know you studied Alzheimer's at Davis.
I did, under
And
Dr. Beth Ober.
Do you remember what you were going into?
So I worked as a research intern at UC Davis, and Dr. Ober's mother had Alzheimer's, and it was really progressive at the time. We would take in this probably a 30-pound computer unit, and I would go in and we would do testing. So we would test them on cognitive testing based on word connections, things like that. The interesting part that I, in a psychology perspective, would look at is that families dealt with dementia very differently. So to me, and you can speak to this, but dementia to me was a spectrum whereby the individual, they themselves didn't always have distress over it, but the family often did, because it was a grief and a loss and all of those things. So some families would spend a lot of time trying to bring them back to center, like here's who the president is, here's who your children are, and like a daily study would occur to keep them up on current events, versus some families that would just take mirrors down in the home. They would kind of allow this more laissez-faire approach and let the patient dictate where they were going to go and what their interests were. And so it was a very different, it was just exposure into like how people manage dementia, and right, wrong, or indifferent. It's I think that's what direction.
It's definitely a family disease. It's definitely a family has to cope with it. Do you remember what you were studying with that? Like, was there an impact? Like, it was more observational studies?
So I think that she was actually one of the first I don't think she was a psychologist, but I think she was dealing with the UC Davis Medical Center and looking at different medications early onset. Okay. Well, early onset, and like what were the early supplements or medications that they were using to kind of improve cognition. So I was just like a data nerd that kind of gathered it, but yeah.
Nothing's changed. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. And I didn't know to ask to be on any papers, so I have no idea where it went. Yeah.
You should be listed. So generally the pathology of dementia is, microscopically you have these two proteins, and everyone's probably heard of them, amyloid and tau. And they're both proteins that basically get entangled into the neuron structure and the support structures, and that causes havoc, and the nerves don't transmit as well as they used to. The supporting cells that surround your nerve cells, they get damaged and they can't protect your nerves as well. And you get these tangles and proteins, and one of these newer treatments that just came out has claimed to reduce amyloid deposition in the brain, and maybe that will have an impact. But essentially, there's two of these microscopic proteins that accumulate. They're likely due to damage or oxidative stress, or any drug medicine can have impact on this, but cholesterol, sugar, blood pressure, inflammation markers.
So once it gets in there, they can reverse it, or they don't know yet?
Well, this drug this new drug says they can reverse it, but the real question is, if they reverse the protein, do they actually make a clinical difference?
And how do they test whether or not you have this?
We'll get into that.
Okay. Jumping ahead.
But essentially, those two proteins, there's a cascade of inflammation. They cause inflammation, and the body can't get rid of foreign bodies as well. There can be infections in there. There's a CSF that bathes your
None
brain.
of these acronyms, we know what you're talking about.
All these are cells in your brain, and they get damaged. And if they
Okay.
get damaged enough, they impact memory.
Okay, so is
Yeah.
it like you have all of these neurons are coming together like spaghetti, and if you didn't have olive oil, they get all sticky? Is that what this amyloid and tau, like,
Sure, that's a good one.
okay. This is what I do. I try to figure out, because he's going to throw out these acronyms. And try to
Yeah, but these two proteins accumulate. The nerves don't transmit as well,
Okay,
basically.
okay.
There's a whole cascade of events, which I'll skip.
No, you can't skip it.
Yeah, I can skip it.
Okay.
It's a bunch of terms.
Well, but if it's important, I feel like I'm confident we can get through.
I think the point is there's a blood-brain barrier that protects your brain. There are cells that transmit nerves and electrical activity. There's other cells in the brain that support those nerve cells, and it's basically these tangles get involved in all of that. So the blood-brain barrier gets affected. The cells that help support your brain cells get affected. The actual nerve cells of your brain get affected. So they all get affected.
Got
So
it.
that's why it can be so sort of catastrophic.
And typically, does the person themselves notice it, or are there people on the outside that notice it first?
It's typically outside.
Okay.
Yeah. So typically the outside. It usually if someone comes into me and they're like, "Oh man, my memory's kind of bad. I'm kind of worried. I forget names, but then I recall it. A couple minutes later." I'm not as worried about them as I am worried about someone that comes in with their significant other, and the other significant other says, "Hey, something's going on." My sort of tone goes up a little bit. They could still both have issues, but it's usually again the other person commenting.
Got it.
So, how do you diagnose Alzheimer's? You need that.
Is that actually a term before you jump to that? Because you were
Alzheimer?
talking about dementia first.
Well, dementia.
and
There's
these
there's
tangles.
there's subtypes of dementia, which I'll go into, but the focus of this is more Alzheimer's and the ApoE gene.
Okay.
So how do you diagnose dementia, or how do you diagnose Alzheimer's? For Alzheimer's, you need that protein present,
Mm-hmm.
and then you need a clinical story that is, consistent, frequent memory issues. Short term, not so much long term. An interesting 2/3 of cases are female driven, and I did do some research, and maybe that has to do with the transition that a female has these hormones that may be protective, and you lose those, when you hit
So it's more,
perimenopause, which you might lose that protective thing. We don't really know for sure.
could be just more insightful because we're paying attention to ourselves a little more.
Well, and you live longer.
Oh, well.
So you live longer. I mean, age is a huge risk factor for any dementia.
Okay.
The longer you live, the more likely, again, you're gonna have to talk.
It's kind of like dust gathers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure. That dust would be in the fact of Alzheimer's would be this protein.
Got it. You're going to talk about how to diagnose it.
So you diagnose it. We do a cognitive test here at LifeScape. We try to do that annually, semi-annually, every 3 to 5 years, depending on what's going on. So we could do that.
What does that entail?
It's a computer-based test. It looks for short-term memory, some cognitive issues. Signs, street signs, recognition of things. It's a screening test. It's not a great diagnostic tool, but it is a means for us to sort of start monitoring you 40s, 50s, and watching, making sure that doesn't dip really quickly. Because it will
Okay.
dip, but hopefully it dips very slowly.
Got it. Once a year?
We can do it once a year, but some patients want to do it every 30 or 50. I think the issue is if you do it consistently, it might be a sort of a precursor to something going on.
Got it.
Now, if that cognitive test shows something wrong, doesn't mean you have dementia, because there can be many other reasons why you have memory issues, like I alluded to, poor sleep and drugs and depression and anxiety. All that can kind of feed into memory issues.
I also think, one of the things that you haven't mentioned is I have a lot of people that when they start to experience like UTIs for some reason, it impacts like memory or cognition or things.
Anytime you have infection, it can throw mentation off.
Okay.
So a lot of, actually, when I worked in hospice, when there was a change in mental status, or even the hospital, a change in mental status, you immediately start thinking infection. Because if you cure the infection, their mentation improves back to baseline.
Got it.
So we can do it. So to diagnose cognitive tests, we do labs to make sure nothing else is going on. And then if we have still suspicions, we can do a full neuropsych test, which is usually a psychologist that does a battery of 2 or 3 hours test. It's basically an expansive cognitive test. And then occasionally we can do MRIs. Now, MRIs don't diagnose dementia, but they look for other reasons, for like small little strokes or inflammation.
But you can't see these like proteins.
You can't see these proteins.
In it.
Yeah, the only way to see that protein is a very expensive PET scan. And with this new drug that's potentially coming out, they're going to be ordering this more. It's like a $4,000 test. But it tags the protein amyloid, which amyloid in itself will deposit in your brain. But if it's at a volume and a story consistent with Alzheimer's, then we can make the diagnosis a little more official.
So are you saying that every single person actually has amyloid in their brain?
Yes. It's
like
likely.
From birth, or like when does it?
It's accumulation of damage. It's sort of like...
Accumulation of damage.
Yeah.
More great news.
Well,
Okay.
tendinopathies happen, in your heart you get calcifications, but it doesn't, every amyloid doesn't mean you're going to get dementia.
Okay.
It means the risk goes up.
Okay. And family history, does that matter?
Absolutely. Family history is something because we're going to talk about ApoE
Okay,
in a
yeah.
second.
Sorry. Always
So,
hit me the head.
yeah. So you can do PET scanning that targets amyloid, and then you can do an LP puncture, which is when they put a needle in the spine, and they get fluid of your
Lumbar puncture.
and they get samples of the amyloid. That's very not common. I mean, typically it's a clinical exam and a cognitive test is pretty much all we use. And then dementia can have several flavors and subtypes, Alzheimer's being the most common. It's probably 50% of the cases. But then you've heard of Robin Williams? Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
he had Lewy body, which is more, they have hallucinations and their fluctuations are sort of day to day. There can be microvascular like strokes, where you get little tiny infarcts in your brain, which cause memory issues. And
So the Lewy bodies are like other deposits, like
yeah,
a different type.
whole different type of
Okay.
dementia.
So
There's
dementia,
subtypes of them.
Alzheimer's, Lewy body, they're all about cognition, but different types of them.
And they have different flavors. They
Different
present
types.
differently. There's frontal temporal, where a person actually has preserved memory, but they start doing things abnormally. Like they'll go pee in a corner for a second, they'll come back and they'll be like, "Oh, that's fine." Like
Okay.
behaviorally, they'll change. But all these are subtypes. And interestingly, most types of dementia are mixed, meaning you'll have a little bit of vascular issues, a little bit of amyloid protein, and maybe a little bit of Lewy body. So there's a lot of them are actually not so,
Well,
structured.
in addition, if you're actually talking about this being a progressive situation with age as that kind of parallel functions going on, like there's other things going on in the body, right?
Right.
Those are those infections and like other things that can be happening.
Yep. And another dementia is CTE, so chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So again, you get a patient with some vascular problems, diabetes, and they played football and had 10 concussions. And
Lacrosse, like other, yeah.
and these things all sort of come together and present with some memory issues. So, and then I mentioned here about stages of grief and how you, when you're diagnosed with that, how do you take that? And I know you had a patient a long time ago with Parkinson's, and I remember you telling me something about that,
Yeah,
how he approached it.
Yeah, it was one of my very, very dear patients and had like other significant issues in the past and came to me and was like absolutely terrified about,
I think it was
end
Parkinson's.
stages. It was
Yeah.
Parkinson's and end stages and not being able to swallow and all these things. And I just, I just looked at him. I was like, at what part do you live in this moment and enjoy today? And I just had this, me and my little spider sense. I was like, I just don't imagine you ever having to like worry about being at that stage. And like, I just had this piece about me with him, and he kind of, he had like signed up to do all these like trainings and learn about it and all of this stuff to kind of dive into it. And my point to him was, you have the diagnosis, you understand the process. If you spend all your time looking at what may be to come, you're going to forget about this moment right now. And he actually booked a cruise, went with his wife, wrote letters to his kids, and ended up having some sort of kind of acute situation anyway, and didn't actually age with Parkinson's. So not that I was predicting that, but it was kind of, and it wasn't in something he intentionally had done. It was some other disease process.
That's you coached him on his emotional impact or his emotional reaction to the diagnosis.
Right.
Yeah. And part of this is, if you are diagnosed with it, the point is, we may not be able to save you, or we can usually sometimes change direction, but in the end, I mean, there's many other things we could do.
So I think we could do a better job talking to people about kind of the aging process, just as a psychological perspective. Like we talk about going to school, trying to get a good job, like raising a family, having community, all those things, and then you get to a certain age and you're like, you retire and you kind of go off into the sunset, but people don't talk about that period of time. So that's where you're jumping in and saying, great news, that's all the stuff that goes on. So
well, it's all about trying to prevent these things. So let's go into prevention. So mitigate prevention. Mitigate, like COVID mitigation. So so there are some preventive measures we can do, and interestingly, this amyloid protein sort of shows up in the brain 10 to 20 years prior to diagnosis, and that's based on autopsy studies. So you can see there's a long lead time of issues. Also, prior to amyloid showing up, you can do some preventive issues too. So it's obviously better to prevent it in your 40s versus in your 80s. A bigger time intervention. So there's, the basics. Exercise is one of the best prescriptions anyone can do. Exercise is huge. You need a little combination of aerobic, which is, running, and anaerobic, where some lifting or body weight lifting or yoga.
You don't have to be running though. You can be cycling, the Peloton.
Anything that gets your heart rate
walking,
going. Anything that gets your heart rate going. And then all the things we focus in on for stroke and heart attacks, like cholesterol, sugar, blood pressure, weight, those again are going to be mitigating factors for the vascular component of Alzheimer's and dementia.
And it's not that you have to have a perfect diet all the time, but you need to focus on making the best choices that you can in those situations and like creating balance in that, because otherwise you get people that aren't going to listen to you.
Yeah, we do the best thing, and we measure biomarkers for those things. We measure your cholesterol, we measure your sugars. So some people can get away with eating more carbs and not have their sugars go awry, and others can eat more cholesterol and fat and not have their numbers go awry. So obviously it's a genetic environmental combination.
And there's a lot of cool tools that look at that. You have the Lumen, and then there's like this thing on the arm, and
you can do continuous glucose monitoring, and then general diet. Lower carbs tend to do better. There's issues on vegetables and vegetarian diets.
You just saw me have a bagel? Is that like, I think that this is like personally right now.
Vegetarian.
Plant-based diet.
Plant-based diet is probably better than eating meat 3 times a day. And again, that's a balance.
3 times a day.
Well, some people do that.
Or somewhere in the middle, maybe.
So it's all, it's about mitigating, right? And then intermittent fasting, there's some studies on that. Adding omega-3s, alcohol, smoke, and then managing sleep and stress, which is her component, her thing. So
what
you help people with stress, cope with stress.
Yeah, I do try to do that.
So I was going to link this to this ApoE gene, which we're going to start talking about, is a genetic test we can do. So there's many genetic tests we do already. The most common one that you've probably heard of, BRCA, BRCA gene, which Angela Jolie had, and she has a
for breast cancer.
Yeah, for breast and ovarian cancer, and maybe pancreatic cancer. There's a lot of cancers actually associated with that. But she had a 70% lifetime risk of developing breast cancer.
Based on having
this BRCA gene. Okay. Yeah, there's 2 types of BRCA genes. But the point is we do genetic tests and we do an impact on it. And we say, these are your odds, what would you like to do? Some people will live with those odds and manage diet and estrogen, and some people will be more aggressive, and with BRCA they'll have a mastectomy.
Is genetic testing something that's common in people? Like, is that something everybody gets done now?
No, it's becoming more common.
Okay.
And there actually is a company called Color Test that tests for genetic risk for cancers that we offer to patients. Now, typically it's for people who have family histories, like their mom had breast cancer, their brother had pancreatic or prostate cancer. So there's tests we can do. But now this ApoE gene is a little different because it's checking for Alzheimer's risk and how you manage cholesterol. So so there are other tests we do that are genetic tests.
But it's not like you just go in and say, I want to do a genome testing of everything I have, and you get this one test.
We don't do that yet.
Okay.
I think in 20 years we might, but not for now.
20 years?
I don't know, 10, 20 years?
I mean, I know that they map it and they can do that. It's just not like
the issue really becomes, is it impactful? So you can test for 1,000 different genes. Is there interventions we could do to change it? So the BRCA.
And would you want to know?
Right.
Right,
Well, that's the
psychologically.
question. In the
Yeah.
ApoE, do you really want to know or do you not want to know?
Okay.
In your case, you had it done because you had
I
it.
did it as a
As an
as
off.
my best friend, and we
Yeah.
wanted to see like if we both had.
Neanderthal?
Well, no. If we were talking about like, you know, some people have like when they eat asparagus, their urine smells, and there's all these kind of like genetic kind of fun things that you can find out
Right.
about yourself in these testing kits. So it really was like innocuous, and then
Yeah.
I got this report, and it was
Yeah.
like,
Whoa.
well, you did that, I didn't, and now I'm here and I'm learning about like why.
Well, again, I do it on some patients. Again, the whole point is, there is something you can change. So if we did a test and we're like, oh, well, good luck, then that would be different.
Yeah. So now that I have one copy of this, anytime that you see me pour a glass of juice or eat a bagel, like,
It's all relative.
okay.
It's all relative.
You can imagine how fun it is at our house.
So this ApoE gene.
Yeah.
So it's located on the 19th chromosome, and it gives you a higher risk for Alzheimer's if you have this subtype. So you basically so for our kids, they're going to inherit one gene from you and one gene from me. So there's 3 types of these genes. There's a 4 gene, which is the one we're talking about, which is a little more dangerous. There's a 3 type, which is the average one, and there's a type 2 type, which is somewhat protective. So in your case, in our
Do I
cases,
have 2?
you have 1. So you're an ApoE 3/4. I'm an ApoE 3/4.
Dang it.
So
I wanted the 2, ApoE 2.
oh, you do want the ApoE 2,
Yeah, I know.
but
Apparently.
you know, again, it's not destiny. It just raises the bar a little bit on the risk, and can you mitigate that risk?
Okay.
So, and the ApoE2, even though it's protective, doesn't mean you're not going to get dementia or Alzheimer's. Just means your risk is lower.
Okay.
So in our case, since we're ApoE 3/4 combo, our risk for Alzheimer's is triple, 3 times. If you have 2 4s, your risk probably goes up 12 to 14 times. And if you have one of these ApoE2s, you're 40% protected. But again, it's not a destiny. It's more of a, okay, what do we do with these risks?
Right.
So you got that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not great news. I have triple the chance of somebody else who doesn't have this gene to become
Exactly.
having Alzheimer's. Although I do have a grandmother who lived to 99 and was she had pretty good clarity towards the end.
Yeah. So
I'm just
maybe.
gonna hang on to that data point for myself.
So maybe she had a 3/4, but she took really good care of herself. She passed and then 3/4 to your dad, and maybe only got 1 copy. So yeah, but again, ApoE is not the be-all end-all. It's not like the only thing we have. There's actually some other, what's it called, APP, presenilin. There's other genes that are responsible for it. So, you know, dementia and Alzheimer's is more multifactorial. There's not just one thing we can point to.
Okay.
ApoE is one thing we can test for, and it carries significant risk, obviously. So I was telling someone the other day about ApoE4 and what does it really mean. It's really hard to figure out. It's not like a protein that floats around in your body. It's more of how you process things. So it's produced in the brain primarily and the liver. And if you think about the liver, that's how cholesterol is that's a lot of the statins work through the liver.
Oh.
So, and it works in your brain. It acts as a conductor. And I was thinking of a septic tank. So if you have your brain, it has a little tiny septic tank, you know.
Oh, like that little tiny.
That'd be like an EE4, 4/4.
Okay.
It just doesn't drain as well. It doesn't clean out the system as well, so those proteins can accumulate more. Where maybe an E2 has a bigger septic tank and it drains the brain a little easier. But we're trying to prevent, obviously, those 2 proteins from accumulating. So
The tau and
the tau and the amyloid, yes. Let's see. So 5 things it does. So you hyperabsorb cholesterol, so you're more likely with a higher saturated fat diet to have a higher cholesterol.
Interesting.
It decreases protection from neural inflammation. So if your brain gets insulted by anything, drug, trauma, whatever, it can't protect itself as well. You have higher vascular damage from smoking and alcohol. So if you smoke and drink alcohol, and you have this ApoE gene, could be, again, you keep raising your risk. If you quit those things, you lower your risk. Reduce response to statins. So some people with ApoE4, I have people before that I hadn't thought about that I put them on a statin, their numbers don't go down. Like, what the heck's going on here? Maybe you have an ApoE4. I've also had people on high keto diets.
A statin reduces cholesterol?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've had people on high keto diets that are high fat. They're consuming 100, 200 grams of fat, and their cholesterol numbers, they'll tend to go up a little bit, but some have this hyper exaggerated response. And we found that in a couple patients, the ApoE4 is elevated.
Interesting. I have pretty low cholesterol.
You have excellent cholesterol, probably because your diet's so good. And then decreased absorption of omega-3 fatty acids, which are protective. So omega-3 fatty acids are protective. Omega-6s, which you find in McDonald's food, are pro-inflammatory. But you don't absorb those fatty acids as much. So, and if you think your brain is like 80-90% fat.
Oh, you should, the supersize me guy.
Yeah, get him. Yeah. Well, again, if you do it chronically, you mean the guy that eats Big Macs every day?
The one that went, no, the supersize, the documentary.
He only did it for 30 days, though.
Oh.
And then he went off.
Okay.
But his numbers went awry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I was thinking about this, and I found, like, why would we have a gene that does all these bad things?
Right.
Why would it promulgate to now? And evolutionarily...
This is going to be more good news, I can tell.
No, evolutionarily, from 0 to 30, it probably protects you a little bit.
Oh.
So protects against miscarriage. So if you think about it, if you have this ApoE4 and you don't miscarriage, you can promulgate your genes to the next generation.
Well, and it probably, like, the effects of cognitive decline is past childbearing years.
Exactly.
So
That's the exact point. Is we had this benefit when we were younger, but now we're going to pay for it in the end. And you know, thousands of years ago, we didn't live past 40. You know, we were done.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was some protection as a young person against certain infections, and stillbirths and miscarriages. But the trade-off is now that we're living to 80 and 100, we're having to deal with this.
Right.
Yeah. Let's see.
80 to 100. Is that like?
Well, that's the goal. The goal is to make it to 80, 100. The goal is to have your lifespan, be it 85 or 90 or 100, equal your health span.
Oh, that
you want those exactly the same.
Yeah.
You know, you want your health span to be perfect, and boom, you die in your sleep or something catastrophic.
This is what gives him stress, because that's what he tries to help his patients do.
Yeah. So we try to make those equal. Obviously, that's impossible, but we don't want you.
You maximize it.
Yeah, we only live into 100, and your last 10 years of life, you're in a nursing home and can't read or can't even have any joy in life.
Right.
So what else was I was going to end with this part.
Oh.
Just a list of general guidelines. The prevalence, that was interesting. Population prevalence. So ApoE3, as far as a population, I think this is studied in the US, is about 64% of people have ApoE3.
Oh.
About 10% have ApoE2, which again is somewhat protective. And the ApoE4, 5% of the population is a double 4, and about 20% is ApoE3/4. So we're 20% of the population.
Okay.
It's weird that we married each other.
Well,
yeah,
for more than that. Just kidding. Just kidding. One of the questions coming in: what if you know that you have this gene that is, now that you've figured this out, do you or should you not test kids? Which is actually the question
we are thinking about that, right? We are considering that now. Yeah. What impact would this have on a young child? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I think as a teenager or 20s, it might be, because they're a little more tuned in, and the frontal brain is, 26, 25 for a man.
It's hard to weigh long-term, short-term. Bill knows this about me. I was thinking about all your risk factors in there. Like, I've never actually tried drugs because we had a lot of familial issues with illicit drugs in our family and things like that. And so I'm pretty conscientious of that. Even as a teenager, I just always avoided it. And so I wondered whether or not, if you have this conversation with your kids and you say, you're at this 5% or 20%, similar to how I talk to kids if they have a high IQ versus someone who has maybe learning, like processing disorders, like I talk to them differently, and they should manage themselves in the world differently because of that. You would think that perhaps children should have some sort of understanding or ability to like start making these early choices. Again,
I think teenagers,
it's obviously a parent call.
Yeah, the parent knows obviously the kid the best, but think about our kids. I don't know. I may wait on one of them.
Yeah.
And
we have one child that I think already like kind of eats like, like is really careful and focused on that, and one that's like I guess, a little
Doesn't.
bit more sensitive. Well, and is also more sensitive and
Yeah.
empathic.
Yeah,
is
right.
a little bit more of my cloth.
Yeah.
So, because I wasn't freaked out until he saw my results, and then of course,
Well, when I saw your results, I want to make sure you didn't have 2 of them,
yeah,
because that's 23andMe didn't comment on that.
thereby starting the bloodletting. When I came in and had to give 18 different things
Right.
of blood.
Right. Well, I did the
Which
same thing.
that would be an interesting presentation to talk about, is like the comparison, you know, because I'm definitely plant-based diet and you are kind of plant predominant but still have meats, and well, I guess you're a guy too,
I'm a man.
which
Yeah.
means I have
You're-
an advantage.
You have an advantage until you lose estrogen, and then your advantage goes down.
Got it.
I mean that's why men have heart attacks sooner than females. Is there's some
Yeah.
protective agent, estrogen, that's there, and we don't have that.
Yeah.
And we have testosterone, which raises our risks for lots of other things.
Yeah.
So it's not equal.
But I think that is a good question about that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I'm generally, I'd say if a person is in tune and smart enough to handle it, and parents on board, that yeah, teens and 20s, I would think about it, especially if the parent has a double 4 or even 1 4.
Yeah.
So I'll end with some general guidelines. So, like I alluded to on dietary fats, you want to watch obviously trans fats and saturated fats. So if someone with ApoE4, this is all kind of tuned into someone who has ApoE4 or 2 of them, is watch your dietary fats. Interesting, I heard this lecture.
Which is what? What does that look like on a label? What's it say?
It says saturated fats. So
Okay.
things I say are salad dressings, like blue cheese, which I love, cheese, and like saturated, like meats. A lot of meats have it, like marbled meats. Interestingly, chicken has some saturated. Everyone thinks chicken's perfect, but chicken has
shrimp has had like
shrimp
high-
has a little more cholesterol.
Oh, okay.
Steak, obviously, hamburger meat. So those would be the saturated fats I would think about reducing. Obviously, again, you don't have to make it 0, but that's where I see some patients that go on keto diets. That's all they're eating is a bunch of that stuff, and their numbers go sort of awry. But I did hear this lecture, and
Another podcast.
no, it's a lecture. It was
Oh, okay.
a lecture from a guy on Alzheimer's. But he said the ApoE4. He's like, he asked this question like, how many people have how many people love cheese? And like about 20% of the population, they raised their hand.
Only 20.
Yeah, and he's like,
Wow.
in his mind, if you love cheese, you might have ApoE4. That was his logic. It's probably just
That's
anecdotal,
interesting.
but
yeah.
I think about me. Do you love cheese?
Like I used to love it more.
Okay,
Yeah, not as much.
I love cheese. So,
Yeah.
so yeah,
So
cheese and keto.
quick question on the comments of whether or not you should actually, or how do you determine who gets tested for genetics? Like, how do you determine that with your patient population? Is it people who love cheese? Like,
Well, now it is. Yeah, if you say cheese, I'm going to test you. You mean specifically for this gene?
Yeah,
Or
well, I mean,
general?
just general. Well, this gene specifically, like if you have a patient who's like, at 50, you've done that with us. Like,
Well,
you're like-
I definitely ask about risk factors. So sleep apnea, snoring. Do you have a family history of early Alzheimer's? That'll start sort of piquing my interest, and then I'll allude to it. If there's no family history, every family member lives to 95. Well, I'm not really going to think. Obviously I think about it with every person, but I would think
Is
it
it
less.
an expensive test, and that's why you may or may not offer it for people? Or like, if I'm one of your patients, like,
If-
I would just kind of want to know, do I have this genetic, or what available genetic test do I have? How do you determine as a doctor?
So for any genetic test, we should pre-counsel you, because you just want to do the test and find out like you did. I mean, essentially, you had no
I'm
counseling.
sure a lot of people are doing that
Yeah. All right.
because
So
of these direct-to-consumer models.
exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But normally, like in a cancer gene test, we'll talk about the family history and say, okay, this kind of aligns. There's a couple cancers that are probably related. Maybe we should do the test. But again, you have to have the impact of what do you do with the results.
Right.
So on a BRCA gene, it's pretty evident. You're going to probably see a surgeon, and that risk is quite high. If you have a lung cancer risk, maybe we do CT lung screens on you at 55. And if there's a colon cancer risk, you probably don't wait till you're 50. You get it done earlier. So yeah, it depends on. You should have some pre-counseling.
Okay. Got it.
And it's not like a metabolic panel that we order on every one of these patients, which we check kidney, liver, sugar. That's just not, well,
That's standard.
that's standard of care. This is by far not standard of care at the moment, but it's
Right.
just one of these things where, we're trying to make impacts to people for the long haul, not just, get them in the door and see you later, like, a common physical would do.
Got it.
So, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see, proper sleep. So a lot of people with sleep apnea. I see people with low testosterone, men, and that's usually a trigger to me that they're not sleeping very well. And sometimes that leads to sleep apnea treatment. So do you have good sleep? And then along with the sleep is restful sleep. Alcohol and smoking. I mean, if you have an ApoE4 and you smoke, I mean, again, this could be a motivating factor. Someone trying to quit smoking, they have ApoE4, that's a really just bad combination. You should obviously consider stopping. Alcohol, you want to reduce your rates. I think the current guidelines say, 1 drink per day, 7 drinks a week is probably acceptable. But if you have ApoE4, maybe that should be less. If you have 2 4s, I mean, the general guidelines say you should probably stop drinking alcohol, just because, again, the toxin accumulates quicker.
Got it. I've had patients ask me, like, if I'm supposed to only have 4 drinks in a week, can I save them all up for Saturday night and have them all at once?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just you want to reduce it.
Okay,
obviously.
I know. Sorry.
Smoking, we talked about omega-3. So we talked about how omega-3s are protective, and potentially ApoE4 doesn't allow you to absorb those as well, although the saturated fats it will. So supplementing with omega-3 supplementation is probably pretty important.
Interesting.
Yeah. Obviously, salmon, mackerel, tuna has omega-3, so those are natural ways to get it.
Oh, we're having tuna tonight.
Exactly. Stress management with Lisa, obviously. Journal.
Yeah. Well, people don't need to have me to help them do stress
Well, you're the
management.
expert. I'm deferring to the expert.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it basically is like looking at your life and figuring out. A simple analogy for me is how many meatballs you have on your plate, and if they're starting to roll off, and you're starting to feel overwhelmed, you need to do something about it.
Right. But other things are relaxation, and I meditate and
listen to
podcasts and get appropriate sleep.
Yeah.
Antioxidants, anti-inflammatories like turmeric, curcumin, ALA, vitamin C, vitamin E. You can probably get those. If you're eating a standard American diet, you probably need some supplementation. If you're vegetarian and eating lots of red, green, purple things, you probably don't need that supplementation.
And then is that something that you would recommend? Like, is that something that you do with your clients and you're like, here's what I would say is like a regimen? Or a
lot of the patients here are already taking supplements, a good multivitamin. But again, if you have the ApoE4 and you're sort of deficient on omega-3s, then we start talking about, trying to up those.
Got it.
And those are the biggest ones. And the biggest things, are exercise, blood pressure, the things we focus in on for, most of my physicals based on preventing heart attacks and stroke, just because of pure numbers of people. Again, the likelihood of me dying, it's going to probably be a heart attack. So we invest a lot of time and energy into that. But the things that we do for that, blood pressure, cholesterol, CRP, inflammatory markers, those are all probably helpful for Alzheimer's prevention.
Okay. So basically, as you're kind of aging, have an expectation that things are going to start to slow down a little bit from a cognitive standpoint. If it seems to be more dramatic or outside people are noticing and it's more consistent,
frequently, yes.
Time to have a conversation.
Yes. And as far as us trying to prevent it, the sooner the better.
Got it.
So that's why we sort of start investing in cognitive testing, 40s when we see most patients for starting to establish these physicals. So that's it.
Yeah. Interesting.
All right. We're going to sign off if no more questions.
Yeah, I think that was good.
All right.
Yeah, I'm not terrified. I
Good.
feel like I have a good knowledge base.
Any other? Yeah, exactly. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
All right. Signing off. Bye. Have a good day.